borderline personality disorder, there's many things I could talk about when it comes to borderline. But in this particular video, I want to talk about why so many people with borderline personality disorder are either diagnosed autistic and or ADHD ahead of getting a borderline diagnosis, or they go on to get an autism or ADHD diagnosis, which then can lead to wondering whether the borderline was actually a misdiagnosis. Before we talk about that, I just want to say that to get a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, the clinician, typically a psychiatrist, but not always, it could be a clinical psychologist, has to account for there being no other reason that could explain the symptoms of borderline personality disorder. Now, my personal opinion on this is that before going down a personality disorder assessment route or alongside a personality disorder assessment route, we should be at the very least doing a preliminary assessment for neurodevelopmental diagnoses, autism, ADHD, whilst that's the medical jargon. Obviously we can use varying different language around the autistic and ADHD profiles, being neurodivergent, etc., etc. The reality is that a large percentage, if not all people who have borderline personality disorder, either were born neurodivergent and are aware before they get a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, or they find out afterwards. And that leads on into the whole misdiagnosis thing with borderline. I was diagnosed with borderline first. It wasn't the first diagnosis I had. I was diagnosed with major clinical depression before that and anxiety. It then went on to me being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder after being in the mental health team for quite some time. And I only went on to find out that I was autistic and ADHD after my son was diagnosed, which was quite some years later. The thing is that when they say that these symptoms cannot be explained by any other condition, the diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder is not the same as the diagnostic criteria for autism and ADHD. If you go into an autism assessment or an ADHD assessment presenting with borderline personality disorder, you will not be diagnosed with autism, you will not be diagnosed with ADHD. Yes, there is some crossover of symptoms, there is, like impulsivity, for example. But ADHD impulsivity is actually very different to borderline personality disorder impulsivity. They present very differently. As someone who has both, I can tell whether it's ADHD based or borderline based quite easily. When we look at why people end up with a borderline personality disorder, we look at people who have a borderline personality style from birth, and I did a video prior to this one that talks about whether we're born with borderline, and then we talk about trauma, and different personality disorder diagnoses are based around different types of trauma. So it's not just the amount of trauma, but it's the type of trauma that you experience too. So borderline personality disorder can come from various types of abuse, but the most common one is invalidation. It's not this person invalidated me at school once. It's consistent and prolonged invalidation. It is all day, every day, throughout childhood, feeling invalidated. Or being invalidated, having your experiences not recognised for what they are. That level of invalidation is the trauma that causes, for the majority of people, the borderline personality disorder diagnosis to be present. So when we look at people that were born autistic and ADHD that often don't find out that they're autistic and ADHD, because you are born autistic and ADHD, for anyone who isn't aware of that, you don't wake up one day with it. Like, we're born autistic and ADHD. If you get diagnosed as an adult, you have lived your whole life autistic and ADHD, whether you knew it or not. Whether the invalidation is coming from parents or teachers, whether it's coming from yourself. Because if we don't know that we're autistic, if we don't know we have ADHD, then we are going to invalidate ourselves day after day after day. When we go into school and the teacher expects things of us that are unobtainable for our particular profile. When our parents expect us to remember all of our things when we pack our bag for school. When they're not feeding those narratives into our brain, we are. So that's where that invalidation comes from. And that, in my honest opinion, is why so many people get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, because the way the NHS, particularly in mental health services, I'd say, it works on the amount that we impact other people, right? So you get seen by CAMHS as a teenager. If your behaviour is problematic, right, then you'll get seen by CAMHS. So the way that the system works is it identifies when we are a problem to other people. The education system's the same. Like, the children that are disruptive are the ones that get their needs met quickest. So borderline, being that it is a visible representation of our inability to cope with the world, with our inability to cope with our feelings, with actions and urges that are scary and uncomfortable for society, for our family members, for our friends, it's logical that the first thing that gets presented to any service, be it CAMHS, be it the adult mental health team, is a personality disorder-like presentation, because that is the crisis point, right? We don't get picked up until we hit crisis point, because the NHS can't afford for that. So that's why borderline is often the first thing that gets picked up. And then once the borderline is picked up and we get treatment and we work through the challenges that are living with borderline personality disorder, it is not for the faint-hearted. Even when it's recovered, like I still have hard days. Like it's not easy. It's just navigatable now. That's the first thing that gets picked up. And as you go through treatment and you start navigating, I have a cat, by the way, who's going to come and get in the video now by the looks of things. You start navigating life and realizing that there are things that don't fit borderline. Whilst I have borderline, there are aspects of me that didn't quite fit that profile. Then you start looking into other things and you start wondering where all of the other boxes fit. And that's how we go down the autism and ADHD route. It's easy, I think, personally, to then go, oh my God, I'm not borderline. I'm autistic and ADHD, and it was missed all of this time. And that's why I have all of these symptoms. It's easy to go down that road, and I went down that road, and there was a period of time that I thought I didn't have borderline personality disorder, and I thought my pathological demand avoidant profile explained my personality disorder, and that I actually didn't have borderline, I had PDA. That is a can of worms that I will just sit with and pull apart at a later date. But I had to go through that process, and then I thought I'm autistic, then I found out I had ADHD, and I thought I didn't have borderline, and I thought that I had been misdiagnosed. But when you deep dive into the symptoms, the clinical symptoms of autism, it's the language, don't really like it, but it is what it is. And you look at the ones of ADHD, neither of those are a full criteria for borderline personality disorder. Even when you combine autism and ADHD, you still don't get a borderline personality disorder diagnosis out of them. So if you meet the criteria for borderline personality disorder, which has very specific characteristics, and you meet the criteria for autism and ADHD, then it's likely you weren't misdiagnosed. It's likely you weren't misdiagnosed with borderline. It's likely they should have picked up that you were autistic and ADHD before they formalised your borderline personality disorder diagnosis, but it's likely you have all three.